Hello, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Stepan Vymetal, and I am a member of the psychological community in the Czech Republic and Europe. I also have long-standing partnerships in my branch of psychology with colleagues from other parts of the world, for instance, Israel, the USA, or Russia. I appreciate the opportunity to present a lecture at this international congress. My lecture focuses on the history, present, and future development of relatively new field, crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. I would like to thank all my colleagues who participated in preparation of this congress during the pandemic. I am glad that this important congress was not cancelled and that a virtual form was chosen, which we are able to adapt. This is proof of our resilience. Now, I will share the presentation. My lecture is called Crisis, Disaster, and Trauma Psychology, Development of the Field, Its History, Present, and Trends. It's based on expert knowledge, which is shared within the international network of psychologists specializing in this field. First of all, some information about my professional background. I have been involved in developing crisis and disaster psychology at the Ministry of the Interior for 20 years. In the Czech Republic, the police, fire rescue service, and civil defense system all belong under the Ministry of the Interior. The integrated rescue system, which is defined by law in my country, is a great advantage. This means that the Czech police, fire rescue service, emergency medical service, and army all work together during a disaster and are controlled centrally. At the Ministry of the Interior, I am responsible for developing central systems for psychosocial response to disasters. This system includes psychological services for the police and firefighters with whom we work closely. I am involved in educating and establishing crisis preparedness, coordination, and psychosocial crisis management during large-scale disasters. I am a psychologist of disaster victim identification team of the Czech Republic and a member of the peer support team of the Czech police. I gained practical experience during specific crises, disasters, and incidents in the Czech Republic and abroad. For example, floods, tsunami, work with hostages, large-scale traffic accidents. I also performed tasks for the Czech Central Crisis Staff during the COVID-19 pandemic. I represent the Czech Republic in the Standing Committee on Crisis, Disaster, and Trauma Psychology under the European Federation of Psychologist Associations. My country has been a member of this international expert group since 2003. This group was heavily involved in establishment of the field of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology in Europe and its very strong network of experts. Mutual sharing of experience, lessons learned, and best practice were crucial for development of this field. I also gained experience working in the Psychosocial Task Force under the World Association of Disaster and Emergency Medicine. EU projects have also provided excellent opportunities for development of this field. I have lectured on the subject of disaster psychology at Charles University in Prague since 2005. And this year, our Department of Psychology celebrated its 100th anniversary. I also encountered trauma in victims of crime as a forensic expert. In my presentation, I will initially focus on the historic roots and development of the field of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. I will mention the key milestones and also sources of knowledge in related branches of psychology, present a definition of this field, and introduce several key organizational and international expert networks which contribute to its development. Other topics that will be mentioned are guidelines, standards, and trends in applied practice. I will also focus on the present and the latest development, and my lecture will end with some of more recent experience, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which impacts the immediate future of this field. Disaster psychology has its milestones in specific extraordinary events. Initially, investigation into the impact of disaster on psyche of survivors are linked to railway disasters in the 19th century. Both world wars and subsequent wars resulted in mass trauma of the surviving civilians and soldiers. Their consequences led to diagnostics of post-traumatic stress and to search for methods of stress management in uniformed forces. This was followed by surveys of survivors in relation to intergenerational and transgenerational transfer of trauma. Air accidents in the USA during the 1990s led to pressure from the bereaved individuals to improve safety and establish a psychosocial support system for people surviving civilian traffic accidents. The topics of biological, chemical, radiation, and nuclear incidents, crisis and risk communication, and further application of psychology within the terms of crisis management were brought to the fore at the end of the 20th century. Psychology is now responding to the effects of climate change, such as heat waves, storms, or wildfires. Crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology has undergone rapid development over the last 2 decades. This is related to the urgent need for it in practice. The extent of climate disasters is increasing. We are witnesses to several massive and prolonged military conflicts. Polarization and violent radicalization leads to local and international terrorism. Terrorism shifts borders, targets human cultural values, and its victims include children. Following the attack on the World Trade Center, there was extensive research on the psychology and mental health aspects of terrorism. We have been witnesses to serious earthquakes and tsunamis and the subsequent Fukushima nuclear disaster. Climate change and military conflict lead to mass migration. We have been facing a pandemic for 2 last years. The extent of disasters, the number of affected people, and the material losses are all increasing. The disaster of the last 20 years often have a global impact. The graph gives you just some events. These are examples of disaster with international or global impact. A number of psychological research projects were created in response to them. There have also been paradigm shifts in crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. Serious accidents occurred within the expansion of railway transport in the 19th century. Following accidents, some patients suffered from functional movement disorder without spinal cord injury, railway spine, or Erickson's disease was a 19th century diagnosis for post-traumatic symptoms suffered by passengers involved in railroad accidents. Oppenheim came up with the concept of traumatic neurosis. He believed that this was a neurological disorder. Charcot mentioned the fact that the symptoms could be caused by hysteria, now known as a conversion disorder. Military psychiatry and symptoms of military trauma in soldiers became the focus in relation to World War I. Dr. Charles Myers used the term shell shock in 1917. The term war neurosis was subsequently introduced. Shell shock or war neurosis is a mental illness causing physical symptoms. On the photo, you can see Australian soldiers near Ypres in 1917. The wounded soldier to the left has a distant look in his eyes, a frequent symptom of shell shock. Today, we would call this an acute stress reaction or dissociation. The following symptoms were also described: headaches, backache, constant sweating, nausea, insomnia, nightmares, mistrust, confusion, depression, or conversion disorders. Military psychology and psychological warfare were employed extensively during World War II. The behavior of civilians in shelters, reactions to bombing, or combat stress were all investigated. The DSM-1, the effects in soldiers were included under the diagnosis of gross stress reaction. The trauma suffered by survivors of the Holocaust and concentration camps was researched after the war. Intergenerational and transgenerational transmission of trauma were also subsequently researched. On the photos, you can see Dresden in February 1945 and people in London sheltering in the underground during the bombing. The Vietnam War was the catalyst for the biggest turning point in the history of war trauma, and its change was brought about mainly by the activism and advocacy of the veterans themselves. After the war ended in 1975, psychiatrists in the US and Australia could not ignore the numbers of men reporting symptoms they initially called post-Vietnam syndrome. DSM-2 was published in 1968, and gross stress reaction were replaced with transient adjustment disorder of adult life. Veterans organization waged a long campaign to have their war experiences recognized. In 1980, post-traumatic stress disorder was finally included in DSM-3. Experience with veterans led to concept of chronic and delayed symptoms, or PTSD. The photo shows a paratrooper after an early morning firefight in July 1966. After 9/11, there was a massive research into the effects of terrorism on mental health. The intervening rescue workers were especially targeted. The terrorist attack on Beslan School and subsequent international terrorist incidents in Europe led to further research of individual and collective trauma and resilience. Research into radicalization was also carried out in relation to war in Iraq and Syria and its secondary effects. Extensive natural disaster with global impact bring new challenges to disaster psychology. In the last 20 years, we have been witnesses to many major earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods. The tsunami in Southeast Asia in 2004 had a global impact also due to the number of affected tourists. The earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear disaster in Japan in 2011 result in a change of attitude towards the nuclear power in many countries. Research was initially concerned with impact on mental health and vulnerability factors. It subsequently focused on resilience factors and coping by individuals and communities. During World War I, the psychological effects of stress were called war neuroses. Their response to the need to eliminate combat stress in soldiers was to implement the principles of psychological first aid. The term PFA was first used in 1957 as a guideline to manage disaster within the community. Another method of early crisis intervention was critical incident stress debriefing, which was a reflection of the need to cope with the acute combat stress. The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was finally classified as a mental disorder in 1980, followed by the diagnosis of acute stress reaction in 1994. The first standards for humanitarian aid appeared in 1997 in the SPHERE project. The critical incident stress management system was support of uniformed forces originated in the same year. The standards of psychosocial crisis aid were developed during the first decade of the 21st century. The created guidelines reflected the need from the field, guidelines for mental health support for large-scale disasters, for early intervention in response to terrorism, psychosocial triage, psychosocial crisis management, community support, support for uniformed workers, or guidelines for psychosocial support of disabled people in disasters were gradually created. Another important change was introduction of the complex PTSD category, which may affect people with childhood trauma, abuse, domestic violence, torture, or other long-term effects of serious trauma. This is a psychological disorder that can develop in response to prolonged, repeat experience of interpersonal trauma in a situation in which the individual has a little or no chance to escape. This new category probably occurs much more frequent in practice than classic PTSD and present a different clinical picture. The fact that the acute stress disorder diagnosis is being phased out and it's considered the normal reactions of a person to extreme stress is relatively new. The prolonged grief disorder category is also new. We can see the development of methods, tools, and procedures is shifting from the original focus on symptoms and disorders towards supporting of coping mechanism and resilience. Development is moving away from the focus on treatment of individuals towards support of coping mechanism and establishment of resilience in individuals and communities. We can see the shift from the focus on the medical impact on mental health towards research of post-traumatic growth and support of biopsychosocial well-being. Emphasis on interdisciplinary cooperation is another important attribute of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. As you can see here, these are examples of standards for psychosocial care during emergency events. One of the oldest is the SPHERE book, The Minimum Standards in Humanitarian Response, which was first published in 1997, or the Interagency Standing Committee's Guidelines for Mental Health and Psychosocial Support in Emergency Settings, published in 2007, or NATO standards from 2008. There is the multidisciplinary European guideline, the European Network for Traumatic Stress guideline of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, Psychosocial Support for Uniformed Workers guidelines, or guidelines for assisting people with disabilities in case of disasters. Various types of psychological interventions are used to minimize impact on mental health, some of which I will mention. The main goal of psychological first aid is to relieve immediate distress and to prevent or minimize the development of pathological sequelae. The concept of PFA for individuals has been applied in the field of crisis management and disaster mental health for many years. PFA was developed to reflect current best practice in disaster mental health based on research, expert consensus, and practical experience. Psychological debriefing. This is a method of structured group discussion carried out a short time after an event. The principle here is cognitive restructuring of the experience event by the individual so that is remembered in a less traumatic way. It also includes a part focusing on sharing adaptive coping strategies. Psychological debriefing has been dramatically discussed, particularly in relation to the risk of the harm caused during incorrect use. Criticism of this method led to improved indications and modification in its use. It's currently used into homogeneous, uniformed forces which jointly intervened at an incident. We now talk about critical incident stress debriefing as a method that is a part of broader system called critical incident stress management. The CISM also includes other methods created by Dr. Jeffrey T. Mitchell and Dr. George Everly. Psychosocial debriefing was originally created for use in the armed forces. Another important method of intervention is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Use of the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing method has increased rapidly in recent times. The author of EMDR method is Dr. Francine Sephiroth. This method has also recently started to be used not only for individuals, but also for group settings. The advantage is that this method is fairly rapid effects. Use of the somatic experiencing method has also been flourishing. The author of this method is Peter Levin. Somatic experiencing is a naturalistic and neurobiological approach to healing trauma. This is a body-oriented psychotherapy. Psychoeducation, counseling, psychorelaxation, and art therapy can be used as a supporting methods. Community-based interventions are non-specific and play a major role in fostering the healing process. These interventions include structuring daily activities, avoiding displacement, support of natural social networks, cultural and religious rituals, group discussions and activities, validation of survivors' emotions, etc., by using available community resources. The first European conference on traumatic stress studies took place in Lincoln, UK in 1988. The American Psychological Association has been active in disaster mental health for over 30 years. In 1991, the APA established the Disaster Response Network in collaboration with the American Red Cross. Since then, psychologists in the USA have contributed to numerous disaster relief operations by offering support to Red Cross responders and disaster survivors. Psychologists have also participated in disaster preparedness planning. Psychologists were involved on voluntary basis in this case. The network was made up of licensed disaster mental health trained psychologists across the United States and Canada. The program name was changed from Disaster Response Network to Disaster Resource Network in 2016. Disaster mental health work now includes 4 pillars: leadership, training, research and theory, and response. Other important participants are, for instance, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Salvation Army, universities, or the International Committee of the Red Cross. The European Society for Traumatic Stress Studies was formally established in 1993. The ESTSS is the umbrella organization for 13 national European associations. In 2007, the ESTSS introduced a general certificate in psychotraumatology and in 2010 published its own magazine under the name of European Journal of Psychotraumatology. The International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies is an international interdisciplinary professional organization that promotes advancement and exchange of knowledge about traumatic stress. The foundation of the ISTSS were laid in Jerusalem at the World Conference on Traumatic Stress in 1996. This was followed in 1997 by establishment of the Standing Committee on Crisis, Disaster and Trauma Psychology under European Federation of Psychologists Associations, initially under the name of the Task Force of Crisis and Disaster Psychology. This is one of the most active FPA expert groups. The first member countries included Great Britain, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Greece, Austria, and the Czech Republic. The group was subsequently joined by the Netherlands, France, Turkey, Spain, Italy, and other countries. The Standing Committee currently consists of 35 representatives of 28 European countries. Sections and task force are gradually created within the terms of national European psychological associations. The Americom Psychological Center was established in 1999 and a unified system throughout the entire Russian Federation has operated since 2003. This system falls under the Ministry of Emergency Situations of Russian Federation and includes several hundred psychologists specializing in emergency situations and many volunteers. For the first time in history of this Congress, the field of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology appears as a separate field. We have accepted a total of 162 presentations, of which 96 are oral presentations and 41 are posters. 7 symposia consisting of 25 additional presentations were planned. Abstracts include a very broad range of topics which reflect the very rapid development of the field. Crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology is a relatively new area of applied psychology. Over the past 30 years, awareness of the impact of disaster on the civilian population has increased. More and more attention is being devoted to the effects of day-to-day crises and traumas on individuals, families, and groups. Psychosocial responses by health personnel and community agents following events such as rape, armed robbery, hostage situations, violence, sudden bereavement, etc., have gradually become a part of what is expected from services in many countries around the world. Additional need concerns psychosocial support in relation to major accidents and disasters. Current topics include, for example, intervention and responses following terrorist attack, psychology within the terms of disaster victim identification, prevention of radicalization, reinforcements of the resilience of individuals, groups, and the community. Then especially vulnerable groups during disaster, the psychology of mass gatherings and evacuations, the psychology of migration, CBRN, including pandemic, impact of racism, adaptation to climate change, etc. In the past 20 years, crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology has been established as an independent branch in many countries, depending on practical requirements. Sources of knowledge. Close interdisciplinary cooperation is crucial for crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. This means a combination of knowledge from a number of psychological disciplines and other related fields. It's an applied discipline which primarily utilizes findings from forensic, clinical, social, military, and intercultural psychology, and findings from psychology applied by security forces. But it's also based on related branches, such as security science, crisis management, disaster and emergency medicine, media studies, and ICT. In recent years, we have encountered the following shifts in the paradigm of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. From viewing an individual as a passive victim to the individual as a survivor who is creative, flexible, and active. From examination of symptoms and disorders to research of coping mechanism, resilience, and post-traumatic growth. From treatment of the consequences to prevention of impact and reinforcement of resilience. From isolated individual to an individual as a member of social groups and communities. From individual intervention to reinforcement of community resilience. On the contrary to the previous, mainly clinical approach, a holistic approach is now being to predominate in crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. As well as intervention, the accent is now also on prevention, crisis preparedness, and mitigation of consequences. Disaster mental health is based on the principle of preventive medicine. This principle has necessitated paradigms shift from relief-centered post-disaster management to a holistic, multidimensional, integrated community approach of health promotion, disaster prevention, preparedness, and mitigation. This has ignited paradigm shift from curative to preventive aspects of disaster management. This can be understood on the basis of 6 R's, such as readiness, response, relief, rehabilitation, recovery, and resilience. According to the APA Dictionary of Psychology, the disaster psychology is specializing domain of training, research, and service provision applied to individuals, communities, and national exposed to a disaster. A key aim of practitioners in this area is to reduce initial distress and foster short and long-term adaptive functioning following a disaster. I continue to expand the definition of this branch by the field of application in crisis management and with regard to a broader range of events. The subject of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology is in an individual, group, or community within the context of a crisis and emergency event. These events are most often mass natural or man-made disaster, such as, for instance, floods, earthquakes, terrorism, mass traffic accidents, war or political violence, migration crisis, or pandemic. However, they may also be serious individual disasters which have a secondary impact on the broader social sphere of the affected individual or the whole of society. For example, cases of brutal violence towards children or other vulnerable victims. This always concerns an emergency event which has significantly psychotraumatizing potential. The emphasis in crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology is to reinform coping, recovery, and resilience on an individual, community, or social-wide level. Psychological findings are applied here throughout the entire crisis cycle. It means within the terms of prevention and mitigation, establishment of crisis preparedness, response, and recovery. The objective of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology is to reinforce the safety and security of organizations or societies, support the resiliency and recovery of individuals and communities, and limit the negative psychosocial effects of disasters. Psychologists can contribute recommendations towards disaster planning, training, and disaster response, and they should adhere to quality standards for psychological intervention in crisis and disaster while doing so. The role of psychology is both to provide direct services based on sound psychological principles and sound evidence-based, as well as to ensure psychosocial crisis management and to provide good quality training to other groups. It's evident that a long-term and multifactorial distress has a global impact on mental health. This is collective trauma. Extensive psychological research is taking place globally in regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. Much of this research focuses on the impact of disaster on mental health of specific groups and on stress and supporting factors or coping strategies. Some studies focus on the potential of individual or collective intervention, lessons learned, and best practice. Psychologists seek new ways to reinforce mental health and establish the resilience of communities and the entire population. Specific stress affects emotions, cognitions, somatic aspects, and social relations. These appear in several categories: information overload, misinformation, disinformation, isolation, separation, loneliness, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, trauma, loss, and grief, exhaustion, stigma, xenophobia, prejudice, and discrimination. Many people without pre-existing mental health conditions are reporting feelings of increased stress, anxiety, and depression. Diagnoses of PTSD or complicated grief are also appearing. The condition of people who previously suffered from mental issues has worsened in many cases. In the case of frontline workers, there is an increased risk of burnout or depression. Suicidal behavior is also no exception. Moral injury from COVID-19 crisis is a new term to most. It's defined as a psychosocial and spiritual burden caused by an act that goes against one's own or shared morals and values. A great number of people face a decline in physical, mental, and social well-being. The global pandemic creates enormous challenges for mental health. We have gained a lot of experience within a relatively short time. Psychologists around the world are aware of their responsibility in relation to prevention, intervention, and mitigation of the impact of the pandemic on mental health. Psychologists are active in interdisciplinary government expert teams. They participate in crisis management and communication. They offer recommendations for crisis preparedness. Psychologists seek new ways, forms, and tools for clinical work with clients, focus on psychotherapy, rehabilitation, and increasing the resilience of the population. There is a lot of psychological research at this time. Specific areas with an increased need of psychological work include children and young people, school and education, work, health and social care, frontline workers, disabled people, the bereaved, long COVID patients, people at risk of violence or radicalization. I would now like to present the system that has proven successful in the Czech Republic. We created the concept of a virtual or online assistance center, which we put into practice. The system consists of a mobile application, central info webs, and system of crisis and information hotlines. The goal was to have all the important and valid information and contacts in time in one place. The information mobile application and psychological websites connected to the system only contain verified and scientifically based information. We have good experience with new formats. These include short videos created by fire and rescue response to the pandemic. Short videos seem to be a more effective way of providing key information compared to written text. They can support people in actively managing the current situation in relation to everyday concerns, but also during the most difficult moments. You can find psychoeducation, tips for psychorelaxation, self-care, and how to help others here. I would now like to introduce an online tool for supporting mental health. In the Czech Republic, we have prepared a website that aims to strengthen the population's mental health and resilience. The website is created in Czech, English, and Russian, and it's freely available to everyone. The main motto is, unusual times bring unusual psychosocial or psychological demands. Strengthen your mental resilience, take care of your mental health, help yourselves and others. This site will guide you in this process. The website contains a psychodiagnostic section where people can test their level of well-being, anxiety, depression, etc. It also includes a section about mental health, links to crisis help and other services, a library of materials, etc. The website is also available as the aforementioned mobile application. And finally, I would like to mention some key points that apply to the future of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. These concern both research and practical application. Participative community involvement in the entire crisis cycle is important. This means involvement in prevention and mitigation, in crisis preparedness, response, and recovery. A community-based approach is essential. Methods and systems for actively supporting the mental health and resilience of the general population must be sought. This means increasing the resilience of the population in relation to future crises and catastrophes. After the experience with the global pandemic, there is a need to foster hope after COVID-19. Move on from collective trauma to collective healing. Research in the field of resilience and coping is necessary. There is a continued need to research the efficacy of the applied psychological interventions. Development of new intervention methods and options, for example, online or telepsychotherapy. Use of new technologies in psychosocial crisis management, training, crisis intervention, and therapy are a challenge. System for psychosocial health in situations with global impact on mental health must be prepared. We can apply the experience from the pandemic to the climate change crisis. It's important to strengthen interdisciplinary and international cooperation in the field of crisis, disaster, and trauma psychology. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Take care and goodbye.